He bled onto the classroom floor between long division and recess, and I should have thrown him out right then. But there was something in his eyes, reckless, broken, begging, that made me hesitate. Hollow Pine had seen its share of drifters, but this one didn't just carry trouble. He was trouble. And somehow, before the chalk dust even settled, I tied my future to his. They say nothing ever happens in Hollow Pine unless someone dies or someone marries. And in that dusty stretch between both, we try to keep our heads down and our hearts buried. But sometimes life doesn't knock. It kicks the door open and bleeds all over your floor. And if you believe second chances come dressed in dusters and blood, or that even the quietest women can end up in the loudest kind of love story, then stick around. And make sure to like, subscribe, and follow along, because what you're about to hear changed everything. That morning, I was teaching decimals to 12 bored children while the Wyoming wind battered the schoolhouse like it had a score to settle. I'd just finished scolding Tommy for trying to cheat off Annie's slate when the door slammed open with the kind of force that makes the soul jump out of your skin, and in he came. He was tall, lean, bleeding from the shoulder, and breathing like the devil himself had chased him through 3 counties. His coat fluttered like torn sails, boots dragging blood across the floorboards. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his head with what might have been charm in another life. "I don't mean to interrupt, but I got nowhere else to fall." And fall he did, right between the stove and the front row, crashing to the floor like a tree giving up on its roots. The children screamed, and for one breathless moment, I nearly did too. But then the part of me that's more steel than sentiment kicked in. I ordered the children to run to Mrs. Kearney's bakery and not look back, then locked the door, knelt beside the stranger, and pressed my palm to his wound like I'd done for my pa back when he got gored by a bull. I don't know what made me do it, instinct, madness, or mercy, but I tore strips from the flag we used for morning recitations and dug out the bullet with my sewing kit and a bottle of whiskey. He didn't cry out, just watched me through one swollen eye and said, "You've got hands like war and heaven mixed together." I didn't reply. I was too busy not letting him die. He passed out cold, and I stayed awake all night, sitting beside him with my shotgun in hand, listening for the footsteps of whatever trouble had followed him into my life. By morning, I knew 2 things for certain. He'd lied about having nowhere else to go. He had come to me for a reason, and I was in more danger than I'd ever been. Not from him, but from what he made me feel. When he finally stirred, the first thing he asked was whether I'd seen any riders in the night. I hadn't, but the way he tensed at every creak of the floorboards told me that wasn't going to last. I asked his name. He gave me Elias. No last name, no explanation, just Elias. I offered him bread and coffee, which he took like a man and used to kindness, and by noon he was gone again, out the door without a goodbye, like a ghost too polite to haunt. But Hollow Pine doesn't forget shadows that deep. 2 weeks later, he returned, this time upright, cleaned up, and carrying a quiet, dangerous kind of purpose. He wore the same coat, same bruised pride, but when he stepped into my classroom after the children had left, he didn't speak of wounds or thanks. He offered me marriage. Not for love, he said, voice like gravel and thunder, but for protection, for peace, for something I don't know how to ask for the right way. I should have said no. Should have reminded him I was a schoolteacher, not a solution. But all I could think of was the way he'd looked at me, like I wasn't just a woman in a small town, but a harbor after a long war. So I told him I'd think on it. But the truth? The moment he whispered those words, I think some deep part of me already said yes. We said our vows under the weight of a Wyoming sky, without flowers, without witnesses worth mentioning. Just his hand wrapped around mine, steady as stone, and the sound of coyotes howling like they knew the world had just shifted. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something wilder, something that might grow roots if the wind ever gave us a chance. By the time I said yes, the town already had its theories, because Hollow Pine never needed facts to start a fire. I'd seen the glances at church, the ones that lingered too long on my left hand, or the man who started sitting beside me every Sunday like it was second nature. They whispered that I'd lost my mind, that I was desperate, that I'd thrown away years of respectability for a drifter with a shadow longer than Main Street. But what they didn't see was how Elias stood beside me when no one else did, how he never tried to fill silence with pretty lies. When he came back to ask again, he didn't bring flowers or poems. He brought a contract, handwritten, honest, and more respectful than any love letter I'd ever read. It said I could keep teaching, that I'd have my own quarters, and that we'd take things slow. It said he wouldn't ask for love, but hoped maybe one day it might show up between the fence posts and the shared breakfasts. So we married under a gibbous moon behind Reverend Caldwell's chapel, just the three of us and the wind. My dress was plain blue wool. His coat was pressed, but still scarred from whatever life he'd dragged behind him. No one cheered. No one to rise. He held my hand like it was sacred, said his vows in a voice that shook just once, and when it was done, he kissed my knuckles the way a man apologizes to a life he's about to interrupt. The ride back to the ranch was quiet. Elias drove the wagon with that same careful stillness he always carried, but I could feel the nerves coiling beneath it, like he was afraid I might jump out before we reached the house. I didn't. I sat there with his coat draped over my shoulders, looking out at the prairie and wondering if any of this would feel real in the morning. The house came into view, a two-story log structure tucked into a bend between hills, porch swept clean, windows glowing like someone had been expecting me. And I guess he had. Inside, everything was arranged with a startling kind of thoughtfulness. Fresh curtains, a vase of wildflowers that clearly didn't grow anywhere close, a writing desk facing east so you catch the morning light, he said. My room was separate, just like I'd asked. But the linens were new, the books stacked on the nightstand included my favorite, Jane Eyre, and that shook me more than anything else. I hadn't told him I liked it. Hadn't mentioned how often I reread the part where Jane chooses herself, even when love burns through her. He'd just known. That night, we ate stew in a kitchen that still smelled like cedar and new beginnings. He asked about my students, really asked. Wanted to know who was struggling, who had promise. I told him about Annie's curiosity and Tommy's chaos, and he listened like those names meant something to him. And when I asked about the ranch, about what kept him up at night besides bad dreams, he told me. Told me about the cattle, the seasons, the way water rights could start wars out here. We talked until the fire burned low, then stood in that awkward hallway where strangers turned spouses pretend not to wonder what comes next. Sleep well, Mrs. Grant, he said softly, tipping his head as if we hadn't just vowed to share a life. And I did. Sleep well, I mean. For the first time in years, the wind outside didn't sound like loneliness. Over the next week, we became something like rhythm. I taught during the day, he worked the land, and at night we shared stories in space. He left little things. Coffee brewed just the way I liked it, a shawl folded on the back of my chair when the mornings turned cold, boots lined up beside the door so I wouldn't trip over them. And I did my part, bandaging his knuckles when fences fought back, baking bread he pretended not to like even as he finished every bite. We were still strangers in some ways, still learning the shapes of each other's silence, but it wasn't empty. It was patient. Then came church, and everything changed. I stepped out of the house in my best dress, navy with white cuffs, and as we walked toward the wagon, Elias held out his arm like it was the most natural thing in the world. I hesitated, just for a second, but then slid my hand through his elbow, and his grip tightened just enough to feel like a promise. At church, he sat close. Not scandalous, not possessive, just near enough that our shoulders brushed. And when Reverend Caldwell asked us to greet our neighbors, Elias placed his hand gently on the small of my back, and the entire congregation seemed to exhale. It was a performance, maybe, a bit of theater to silence gossip. But when he leaned in during the hymn and whispered, "You look beautiful today, Cora," I forgot that we were pretending. That night, he fixed the back gate without me asking, and when he came in with dirt under his nails and sweat on his brow, I saw something in his eyes I hadn't dared hope for. Comfort. Like the house didn't feel so empty anymore. Like I didn't either. And before bed, he lingered at my door, as if he had something else to say. He didn't. But I watched his shadow move down the hall, long and quiet, and I wondered if maybe, just maybe, this wasn't about safety anymore. Maybe it never had been. The night I picked up a gun for the first time wasn't the night I learned how to shoot. It was the night I learned how to choose. Between silence and speaking, between fear and fury, between watching the man I'd come to care for be destroyed, or standing beside him in the fire, even if it meant we'd burn together. The first threat came wrapped in a polite smile and a legal-looking envelope, carried by a man named Silas Crowder, who wore a badge and smelled like whiskey and ambition. He said he was with the territorial office, here to review a land dispute regarding Elias's north pasture. Rich soil, plenty of grass, and apparently a fresh claim filed by Marcus Dade, a neighboring rancher with too much money and too little soul. I stood beside Elias on the porch while Silas read out his memorized lines, and I watched my husband's jaw tighten with each word. When the man tipped his hat and rode off, Elias didn't speak for a full minute. Just stood there staring out at the hills like they'd betrayed him. "That land's ours," he finally said, low and certain. "My father fenced it himself, died on it. And though he didn't say it, I knew the rest. I'll die on it too, if I have to." From that moment, the rhythm of our home changed. Elias grew quieter, like he was bracing for something. He started carrying his rifle again, not slung casually across his back, but close, ready. At night, he would sit at the kitchen table, papers spread out, tracing boundary lines and muttering about survey markers. I tried to stay in my lane, teach, grade, cook, but it became harder with each sunrise. Because this wasn't just about pasture land anymore. It was about legacy, about the ghosts Elias had never spoken of. And as much as I'd married him for stability, I realized I now stood at the center of his war. The breaking point came when I found the forged deed. It was tucked inside a book in the church library, of all places, wedged between pages of cattle breeding in the American West. I was looking for something to better understand Elias's work. What I found instead was a carefully aged piece of paper with a surveyor's name that hadn't been licensed until 3 years ago. My teachers, I caught it immediately. Wrong ink, wrong strokes, too perfect in the way all lies try to be. I ran home, wind whipping my shawl off my shoulders, and burst into the barn where Elias was tending a limping mare. "It's a fake," I gasped, handing him the paper. "A clean forgery. Marcus Dade didn't just claim your land. He fabricated the history to steal it." Elias took the document with a calm that scared me more than rage would have. He studied it like a man reading the death certificate of someone he hadn't realized he was still mourning. "He's been trying to erase my father," he said quietly. "First with dirt, now with ink." That night, the windows stayed dark. Elias sat at the table cleaning his old Winchester, his hands steady, his face carved from stone. And I opened the drawer where I kept the pistol he'd taught me to use, and loaded it with trembling fingers. "You're not going alone," I said. He looked up, weary but not surprised. "Cora, no." I crossed the room and placed the pistol between us. "You told me once you never meant to drag me into this." But I walked into it with my eyes wide open. "You are mine, Elias Grant. And I will not sit behind lace curtains and watch you get buried for land your father died trying to hold." He stared at me like I was someone he hadn't dared imagine, like his quiet schoolmarm had grown iron bones and wildfire. He reached for my hand, the calluses of his fingers brushing mine. "Then we do this together." The next morning, we rode to the county office. I marched in with the forged deed, laid it in front of Silas Crowder, and cited the inconsistencies like I was delivering a classroom lecture. He tried to bluster, but the pressure from a growing crowd outside, the town that had started watching, wondering, choosing sides, made him squirm. Within hours, Silas was gone, and Dade? He showed up on our property that night with 2 men and bad intentions. Elias and I were ready. Our lanterns were already out. The livestock had been moved. And half the town, Reverend Caldwell, Annie's father, even the grumpy widow who never smiled at church, stood waiting in the dark with rifles of their own. We didn't shoot that night, but we didn't back down, either. When Dade snarled his threats, Elias stepped forward and said in a voice like gravel and thunder, "You put one toe on my land again, and I won't send words. I'll send lead." And just like that, the storm passed. The land stayed ours. The town whispered about it for weeks. Said the schoolmarm and the outlaw had pulled off something legendary. But what mattered most wasn't what they said. It was what came after. The next morning, Elias didn't reach for his rifle. He reached for me. No pretense. No fear. Just arms that wrapped around me in the quiet before dawn. Lips pressed to my temple like an apology and a promise all at once. "My heart belongs only to you, love," he whispered. "Always did. Just didn't know it till you picked up that pistol." And me? I didn't cry. I just held him tighter. Because love doesn't always bloom in the soft moments. Sometimes it ignites in the fire. And if you're lucky, you burn together.